I remember the morning like it was still lingering in the air, even though years have passed. The sun had just begun to rise, spilling a pale orange glow across the kitchen, and I was sitting alone at the small round table, my hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea. I had made breakfast earlier, hoping someone might join me, but the house was quiet. Silence had become a familiar companion, more reliable than anyone else in the family. I traced the rim of my mug with my finger and thought about the years that had passed so quietly, the laughter and chatter that now seemed like echoes from a distant life. It wasn't always like this. Once, the house had been full of voices, full of warmth, full of small moments I treasured more than anything. My son, Jack, had been the center of my world, a bright, curious boy who would come running down the stairs with his hair sticking up in every direction, asking me to make pancakes just the way he liked them. And now, he walked past me without a word, headphones on, eyes glued to his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. I took a deep breath and smiled faintly, because what else could I do? The quiet hurt more than shouting ever could. I had always tried to understand, to give space, to be patient. But there were moments like this morning that made it almost unbearable. I remembered his words from the night before, softly spoken, almost apologetic but cutting all the same. "Mom, maybe you should let us have our space." He hadn't meant to be cruel. And yet, in that calm, measured tone, the truth landed. I was no longer the mother at the center of his world. My place had shifted, and not even I knew where I belonged anymore. I sipped the tea, letting the warmth run through me, trying to soothe the ache that seemed to have settled in my chest. The smell of toast filled the air, comforting and familiar, but it was as if the warmth of the kitchen couldn't reach the coldness I felt inside. I thought about all the little things I had done, all the quiet sacrifices that went unnoticed. The late nights waiting up when Jack had been sick, the endless laundry, the meals prepared exactly the way he liked. I had done it all without complaint, without expectation, because that was what mothers do. But mothers also feel, and feeling this overlooked, this invisible, was almost too much to bear. I looked around the kitchen, at the little notes I had left on the fridge over the years, reminders for appointments, school projects, simple "have a great day," scribbled in careful handwriting. They were still there, faded slightly with time, and I realized how much of me existed in small, silent ways. It was the quiet presence of a mother who had loved, who had given, who had tried to keep a family together even when it felt like the threads were fraying. And yet, the love I had given freely, wholeheartedly, seemed to have been forgotten overnight. Just a simple line, "maybe you should give us space," and the world I had known shifted. I pressed my hand to the table, feeling the cool wood beneath my fingers, and I thought about my own mother. I remembered how she used to sit with me in the same way, in the quiet early hours, just being there without speaking. Sometimes presence is enough, she had told me. Sometimes the small gestures, the gentle acts, the silent care, those are the things that build a life, hold a family together. But what happens when the gestures are unseen? When the care is unacknowledged? The silence becomes deafening, and the ache begins to thrum like a constant heartbeat I can't ignore. I stood and moved to the window, watching the street below where the autumn leaves swirled lazily in the wind. There were families walking, laughing, dogs bounding alongside children, and I felt a pang deep in my chest. That could have been us, I thought, my voice barely a whisper. That could have been laughter echoing through our house. But instead, it was empty hallways and quiet rooms. And yet, even in the ache, I felt something else, a quiet determination to remain, to observe, to survive this new rhythm of life that had replaced the old. I had learned long ago that resilience isn't loud. It's quiet. It's steady. And today, I needed that more than ever. The breakfast plate sat untouched on the table. Jack had disappeared to his room, leaving only the echo of his footsteps. I poured another cup of tea, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. There was a rhythm to this quiet, a kind of peace in being present even when ignored. I thought about the years I had spent shaping this family, the love that had flowed silently from one day to the next. And even though it hurt to see that love unrecognized, I knew that it still mattered. Even if no one else acknowledged it, I had given it. And in that giving, there is a kind of quiet victory. I opened the little drawer beside the stove and found an old letter I had written to myself years ago. During one of those long, sleepless nights filled with worry and hope, I read the words slowly. You are enough. You are seen by the one who matters most. Trust in the love you give, and it will return in ways you cannot imagine. I smiled, tears pricking the corner of my eyes. Even now, the letter seemed to speak directly to my heart, reminding me that I was more than the recognition I received. I was more than the quiet dismissal, the invisible moments. I was a mother, a woman, a witness to the slow unfolding of life, and so I sat quietly, taking in the morning light as it touched the countertops and the floor, thinking about the small things that held a family together, the moments that were unseen yet profoundly important. I realized, with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude, that this quiet heartbreak was also a teaching, a gentle insistence to notice, to cherish, and to continue loving without expectation. It was hard, unbearably so at times, but it was real, and it was mine. And perhaps in the soft, still moments of reflection, there is a kind of peace that cannot be taken, a quiet strength that no words can diminish. I heard the faint click of the front door, a sound that made my heart quicken. Maybe it was Jack returning, or perhaps someone else, a friend, a distant relative. I didn't know yet. I only knew the quiet tension of hope and the echo of disappointment that had become familiar in my days. And in that space, I understood something new. Love is patient. Love is enduring. And sometimes it lives in silence, waiting to be seen in the smallest of gestures, the quietest of moments. The unnoticed presence of a heart that keeps giving even when it is invisible to the world. The house felt different now than it had even a few years ago. The walls were the same soft cream with the faint cracks near the corners, but the air carried a heaviness I hadn't noticed before. I used to wake in the morning to the chatter of breakfast, the scraping of plates, the smell of Jack and his sister Rosie's sneakers squeaking against the floorboards as they ran out the door for school. Now, the quiet had settled like a fog that wouldn't lift, and I was learning to navigate it without resentment. Though it wasn't easy, my family had always been close, in our own complicated way. My son Jack, now 28, had grown into a man with a career and a life that no longer revolved around this house. Rosie, my daughter, had moved across the country years ago, chasing her dreams and leaving only letters and video calls as reminders of her presence. And my husband, long gone, had passed peacefully a few winters back, leaving me with memories and an unshakable sense of responsibility for the home we had built together. I often thought of him, his quiet encouragement, the way he could make a room feel lighter just by entering it. Even now, in his absence, his memory provided a sense of grounding I clung to. I sat in the living room, my hands folded over my lap, looking around at the familiar furniture. Each piece told a story: the worn couch where Jack had first learned to crawl, the little coffee table that Rosie had accidentally scratched while playing, the bookshelves lined with novels and family photo albums. Each memory was stitched into the fabric of the house, a reminder of years of love, sacrifice, and small, mundane joys that had once felt like everything. Jack had been my world once. I remembered the day he was born, how small and perfect he was, and how I had held him for hours, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. Those early years had been full of laughter, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and the never-ending questions of a curious mind. And as he grew, I had watched him with quiet pride, marveling at the young man he was becoming. Not knowing that life would someday pull him so far from my reach, I often thought about my role in his life now, as a mother who had given her all and now had very little recognition. The moments of guidance, of patience, of late nights spent worrying about his future, had they meant nothing? I told myself that love isn't measured by acknowledgement. Still, I couldn't deny the sting of watching him drift into a life where I felt increasingly invisible. The day I first noticed the distance, it was subtle. Jack had invited a few friends over, and as I offered snacks and coffee, I saw the slight, almost imperceptible eye roll, the quiet whisper of a joke that didn't include me. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't intentional, perhaps, but the effect was the same. I felt like an observer in my own home, a shadow in the life I had nurtured. Rosie, my daughter, had always been the more independent one, seeking adventures far from home. I loved her courage, even if it left me alone more often than I wanted. I still remember the day she left for college, her suitcase packed and her eyes bright with excitement. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "Mom, I'll call every day." And I believed her, holding back the tears because I wanted her happiness above all. Those calls continued for a while, but eventually, life moved forward, and the frequency waned. I understood, and yet the quiet was difficult. I think that's why my relationship with Jack became so pivotal. I believed that he would always need me, that the bond we shared was unshakable. And for years, it was. We shared lunches, talks about dreams, the small joys of daily life. But marriage changed everything. He married someone wonderful, or at least I had hoped. But life, as it often does, introduced complexities I wasn't prepared for. The dynamics shifted. My voice became quieter, my suggestions less welcome, and slowly, the house that had once been full of warmth began to feel like a place I inhabited without belonging. I took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen, examining the small notes I had left over the years. Recipes for Jack, reminders for Rosie, a folded piece of paper with my husband's handwriting reminding us to be kind, patient, and forgiving. Each note held a memory, a piece of care that I had poured into this family. And yet, despite all of that, the simple act of being present was no longer enough. I felt a quiet ache, a loneliness that was not loud but persistent. Settling into the spaces I had once filled with laughter, I prepared breakfast slowly that morning, the smell of eggs and toast filling the kitchen. The ritual was comforting, familiar, but it carried a new weight. I placed the plates carefully on the table, imagining Jack walking in, smiling at the food, perhaps exchanging a few words with me before rushing off to work. But I knew he wouldn't. He hadn't for weeks, not in a way that felt connected, and the realization sank into my chest like a stone. And yet, I didn't let it break me. I reminded myself that love isn't about acknowledgement. Love is constant, steady, and patient. And that's what I had to be. I had learned to find solace in the small things: the morning light falling through the windows, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the memories tucked into the corners of the home. They reminded me that my presence mattered, even if it wasn't noticed in the way I longed for. I thought about my mother again, how she had taught me the quiet strength of patience, the subtle power of enduring without complaint. Life will test your heart, but the heart that gives freely will always be heard, even if not by everyone, she had told me. And now, I understood that more deeply than ever. The quiet moments of care, the unseen gestures, the love that flows without expectation, those are what truly build a family. What truly hold a heart steady in the face of distance and silence. And as I looked around the kitchen, at the old coffee mugs, the photos on the refrigerator, the folded notes, I realized that my family was still here in some way. Perhaps not in the way I had hoped, not in the laughter and chatter I remembered, but in the subtle threads of memory, love, and presence that lingered like a quiet song. And maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. Perhaps the quiet would be broken, not with anger or shouting, but with understanding, recognition, and the gentle unfolding of hearts learning to see one another again. The quiet of the house had begun to feel heavier over the past few months, almost tangible. It wasn't that anyone was intentionally cruel. Jack and his wife, Marley, weren't harsh people, but life had a way of creating distance without anyone realizing it. Small moments, unnoticed by others, began to weigh heavily on me. A plate left in the sink for hours, a glance that didn't linger, a conversation that I was quietly excluded from. They were little things, and yet, together, they built a wall between us. One evening, I was in the living room folding laundry when I heard Jack's laughter from the dining area. Marley had invited a few friends over, and they were chatting over dinner. I paused, hoping for a moment of connection. A mom, come sit with us. But none came. I took a deep breath and returned to my folding, reminding myself that this was part of their lives now, that my role had shifted. But the ache in my chest refused to fade. Over time, the comments became quieter but sharper in their effect. One afternoon, I had suggested a recipe I remembered my husband loved, hoping to surprise Jack with a taste of his childhood. Marley had smiled politely but brushed it off, saying, "Jack, I'll make something else tonight. Don't worry about it." There was nothing harsh in her words, yet the message was clear. My input no longer held weight. I felt my heart tighten as I quietly stepped back, keeping the memory and the recipe folded away in my mind like a secret dot. It wasn't just Marley, it was Jack too. I noticed him growing distant in subtle ways. He would nod absent-mindedly while I spoke, his attention on his phone. Conversations that once flowed naturally became clipped, as if he was measuring his words, unsure if he wanted to share this part of his life with me. I understood the demands of adulthood, of marriage, of building a new life, but my maternal instinct ached for the closeness we once had. The small silences at the dinner table became my most painful moments. I would sit there quietly, spooning food onto my plate, listening to the laughter of others. It was the laughter of family, yes, but not my family in the way I had known it. I tried to remind myself that love isn't always loud or visible, that sometimes it exists in quiet spaces, but even the quiet love I offered seemed to go unnoticed. One particular evening stands out. I had spent the afternoon preparing Jack's favorite dessert, a chocolate cake we had baked together when he was a boy. The smell filled the house, warm and inviting. I placed it on the table, hoping for a shared smile, a word of thanks. Instead, Marley glanced at it and said, "Oh, I already made something else for us." Jack didn't even look up. My hands shook slightly as I put the cake back in the fridge, swallowing the lump in my throat. It wasn't dramatic, not a fight, not even a harsh word. It was silence, exclusion, and subtle dismissal, the things that cut deepest. I began to notice other small patterns as well. Letters I had mailed to Jack, updates on family birthdays or news, often went unanswered. He had stopped calling as frequently. Even his voice over text messages felt distant. The warmth I once felt replaced with brevity. It was like a gradual drift, and no one had anchored me. In the mornings, I would linger in the kitchen, hoping for a chance to connect, to share a quiet moment before the day's chaos. Jack would pass by, barely acknowledging my presence. Marley would greet me politely but never linger. Their world had become so full of activity and friends, projects and plans, that there seemed to be little room left for me. And yet, I did not let my sadness turn into resentment. I reminded myself of all the years I had nurtured and loved, of all the care that had shaped them. Still, the emptiness at the heart of these interactions made me wonder, had I lost them without even realizing it? Sometimes the most hurtful moments came from the things left unsaid. I would ask Jack about his day, expecting the small details of his life, the stories that once flowed freely. He would reply with one or two words, then retreat to his room or office. Marley, who once laughed at my stories, now simply nodded. I could feel the gap growing, stretching across the dinner table, across the living room, into the hallways of the house. The walls themselves seemed to echo with the quiet I carried within me. I began writing notes to myself, small reminders to hold my composure, to speak kindly even when my heart was heavy. Sometimes I would jot down what I wanted to say to Jack. How proud I was of him. How I missed our shared laughter. How I longed for just a moment of attention, a glance that showed I mattered. But when the time came, I swallowed my words, keeping the longing inside. After all, I had learned long ago that patience and love often speak louder in silence than in words. One afternoon, I saw Marley going through a family photo album I had left on the coffee table. She smiled politely at a picture of Jack as a child, his cheek pressed against mine, a chocolate stain on his shirt. I felt a pang in my heart. I wanted to say, "Do you remember this day?" But the words never came. She closed the album with a soft sigh, and the moment passed. The acknowledgement I had silently hoped for was never voiced, and the ache of being unseen returned. Even when Jack tried, the moments were brief and fleeting. He would sit next to me for a few minutes, sharing a smile or a story from work, only to disappear as quickly as he arrived. And yet, I cherished these tiny fragments, clinging to them like lifelines. They reminded me that our bond wasn't completely gone, that somewhere deep inside, the connection remained, waiting for a spark to reignite it. During these months, I spent many evenings in the quiet of my bedroom, reflecting on the life I had built, the sacrifices I had made, the love that flowed without expectation. It was a meditation in patience, a practice in grace. And though the house felt increasingly empty, I reminded myself that love is persistent, that its power lies not in acknowledgement but in the steady, unwavering presence of the heart. Sometimes I thought about leaving, walking away from the quiet pain. But then I would look at the photographs, at the familiar furniture, at the notes and letters tucked in drawers and on shelves, and I knew I could not abandon them. My role was different now, perhaps quieter, but it was still important. And I understood, perhaps more than ever, that love is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and endures in silence. The first cracks of conflict had begun to show, subtle but undeniable, and I could feel the tension mounting, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, quiet now, but certain to arrive. The question was not if it would come, but when and how I would meet it with the patience, the love, and the quiet strength I had cultivated all these years. The quiet tension in the house was no longer just a feeling. It had started to shape the rhythm of my days. Even small tasks became weighted with the knowledge that my presence might be overlooked, my contributions ignored. I noticed it first in Jack's tone when he spoke. Words that once carried warmth now landed flat, clipped, like someone who had learned to measure their affection in careful portions. One evening, I decided to bake his favorite muffins, a treat he had loved since childhood. The smell filled the house, rich and comforting, like the memory of mornings we had spent together. I hoped he would come into the kitchen, perhaps laugh at my slightly uneven muffins, like he used to, and share a story about his day. But when he walked in, he barely glanced at me and muttered, "Thanks," before retreating back to his office. Marley was nearby, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging the warm aroma of the muffins. My hands paused, hovering above the counter. The small gesture of love met with casual dismissal. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way a heated argument would be. There was no shouting, no slam of doors, just subtle, quiet, and unmistakable distance. That is what hurt the most. I could feel the emotional space growing between us, invisible yet impossible to ignore. I had tried to bridge it with conversation, with small acts of care, but each time the response was polite yet detached. It made me wonder if my presence, once central to their lives, was slowly becoming invisible. At the dinner table, the dynamics shifted further. Conversations that used to be filled with laughter, jokes, and stories became sparse and measured. I found myself speaking less, not because I had nothing to say, but because each word felt like it fell into a void. Sometimes Jack would nod without really listening. Marley would smile politely without engaging. Even when I tried to share something personal, a memory, a thought, a question, it was met with quiet indifference. The house, once full of life, now felt muted. One afternoon, I found a stack of letters I had sent Jack tucked in a drawer, unopened. Birthdays, updates, little notes of love and encouragement, all set aside, ignored. My heart sank, and I wondered if he had any idea how much I had poured into these small gestures. I did not feel anger. Instead, I felt a quiet ache, a growing awareness that the connection I had relied upon for years was shifting beyond my control. There were fleeting moments of warmth, too, which made the silence between them even more painful. Jack would occasionally glance up from his work with a soft smile, or Marley would remember a detail I mentioned weeks ago. But these were brief, rare sparks in the long stretches of quiet, reminding me of what had been and what could be. They were bittersweet, like sunlight through clouds, beautiful yet fleeting. I started to notice the unspoken rules that had begun to govern our interactions. My suggestions were often overlooked, my attempts at conversation sidestepped. Even when I spoke about family matters, Jack and Marley would exchange looks, subtly communicating without words, leaving me on the outside. The realization stung. My role in this family, though never formally diminished, was quietly being redefined, and I had no say in the matter. One evening, after preparing dinner, I watched them eat without joining in. Jack had mentioned a work story. Marley laughed lightly, and I felt like a shadow sitting at the table. I wanted to say something, to share a memory, to reconnect, but my voice faltered. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the scrape of utensils and muffled laughter. I reminded myself that love does not demand recognition. But even with that knowledge, a part of me longed for acknowledgement, for a simple, shared glance that said, "I see you, Mom." There were moments when I questioned my own perception. Perhaps I was imagining distance where there was none. Maybe Jack was simply busy, Marley focused on her own life. Yet, the pattern repeated itself, day after day, week after week. It became impossible to ignore the slow erosion of connection. Each small act of indifference, each fleeting smile, each polite nod became a thread weaving an invisible barrier around me. I found myself retreating into quiet reflection. I would sit in my room, writing notes to myself about the love I still carried, about the hope that things could change, about the patience required to endure this slow distancing. I remembered the countless nights I had stayed up worrying for Jack, the meals I had prepared, the guidance I had offered, and the unconditional love I had given. And though I did not feel bitterness, I did feel the weight of absence, a hollow ache that grew heavier with each passing day. Occasionally, I tried subtle acts of connection, leaving a small note on the fridge, preparing a favorite snack, asking a gentle question about their day, but the responses were minimal. Thanks, or a polite smile, or no acknowledgement at all. It was not cruelty. It was distance, quiet, pervasive, and unspoken. And yet, I clung to the moments when their eyes met mine briefly, holding onto the tiny sparks of recognition like life rafts in a vast sea of quiet. The emotional distance began to affect my days in other ways as well. I noticed that I hesitated to speak, to reach out, to suggest or share. My words felt fragile, my presence tentative. I became an observer in my own home, watching the family I had nurtured from a careful distance, longing for closeness but unsure how to bridge the widening gap. It was a painful, quiet realization. Love alone was no longer enough to keep us fully connected. During these months, the small gestures of exclusion continued, and I learned to carry them with grace. I reminded myself that the bonds of family are complex, that they evolve over time, and that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. I could not force connection, but I could remain present, offering love quietly, without expectation. As the tension built, I sensed that a significant moment was approaching. A moment that would either break the fragile threads we still shared or open the door to understanding. I did not know what form it would take, but I felt the anticipation in the air. A quiet storm gathering, subtle yet undeniable. The rising conflict, though gentle and slow, had set the stage for the turning point that would change everything. The moment of change arrived quietly, without fanfare, but it carried a weight I could not ignore. It was a late afternoon when I had just finished tidying the living room. The sun filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the furniture, and everything felt ordinary, calm, familiar, predictable. But in that calm, I noticed it. The distance between us had grown tangible. Like a wall I could almost touch, I had placed a small tray of tea on the counter, hoping to invite Jack and Marley to sit for a quiet moment together. It had been a week since we had shared any meaningful conversation. When Jack walked in, he paused, glanced at the tray, and then looked past me, speaking only to Marley. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes," he said, not making eye contact. Marley nodded, barely acknowledging my presence. I felt my chest tighten, a subtle ache building, but I forced a smile. I just thought we could sit together for a few minutes, I said softly. My voice was calm, measured, careful. Jack's response was curt. Maybe later, Mom. Later. The word landed heavily in the room. It was polite, yes, but it carried a quiet finality that I could not ignore. My heart sank, and for the first time, I felt a pang of real fear that the home I had nurtured for decades no longer felt like mine in the same way. That evening, a conversation, or rather, a series of small, cutting remarks made everything painfully clear. We had gathered around the dining table for dinner, a simple meal I had prepared with care. As we began eating, Marley mentioned plans for a family trip. She said, casually, almost as if it were an afterthought, "We didn't think to invite you this time, Mom. It's just adults and kids." Her words were soft, but I could hear the unspoken message. I was excluded. Jack didn't defend me, didn't suggest that my presence was welcome. He simply looked down at his plate, quietly acknowledging her statement without comment. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I felt the warmth of my home slip away in that instant, replaced by the stark realization that I was no longer central to this family. I kept my voice steady, though inside I felt every twinge of hurt. "I understand," I said. "I just thought it would be nice to go together. All of us." My words hung in the air, soft and unassuming, yet they seemed to echo loudly against the growing wall of distance. That night, after the dishes were done and the house had settled into its usual quiet, I reflected on the series of small events that had led to this point. Every overlooked conversation, every ignored gesture, every polite but empty smile had built toward this moment. The days following that quiet exclusion at dinner were heavy, but the real moment of heartbreak arrived unexpectedly. It was late afternoon when Marley called Jack over to discuss something about the house renovation, something trivial, really, but the way they spoke left me standing in the corner, unnoticed, as if I were a shadow passing through my own home. I had carried groceries in both hands, carefully choosing fresh vegetables for the evening meal, but no one acknowledged me. I placed them on the counter with a soft thud, hoping to be noticed. Still silence. Jack glanced at the vegetables and then at Marley. "Could you handle this part?" "I'll be back in a few minutes," he said, and turned around without even meeting my eyes. Marley nodded, her attention fully on him. That was it. A gentle but unmistakable erasure. I walked away slowly, my steps echoing in the quiet kitchen. My heart ached, not in anger, but in a muted, heavy sadness. Later, while folding laundry, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. Marley was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, yet the words were clear. "I don't want her interfering with anything," she said, almost a whisper. "She thinks she's still running the house. I just want Jack and me to handle it ourselves." My hands froze mid-fold. My body felt heavy with the weight of the words. It was not yelling, not shouting, just a quiet assertion of exclusion, but it cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. I retreated to my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, letting the room embrace the quiet. The ceiling fan spun lazily above, the sunlight fading into a warm amber glow, and I allowed myself to feel the sorrow without trying to fix it. I whispered to myself, "This is real. This is the turning point." The silence around me was both suffocating and strangely comforting. I realized the home I had given so much to nurture was slowly slipping from my emotional grasp. That evening, I tried again to reach Jack, hoping to bridge the widening gap. "Jack, can we talk about the house plans? I have some thoughts." I began cautiously, but he cut me off with a soft, dismissive tone. "Mom, we've got it covered. You don't need to worry about this." It was not rude, yet the meaning was crystal clear. My input, my voice, no longer mattered in decisions I had once been central to. I sat alone in the living room later, holding a small framed photo of Jack when he was a boy. His smile, full of trust and affection, stared back at me. I thought about all the years I had poured love into this family: meals, school projects, late-night talks, bedtime stories. Each effort had been made quietly, without expectation, and yet now it seemed invisible. The weight of realization settled over me. The emotional breaking point had arrived. The quiet betrayal was not about money, possessions, or even visible disrespect. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider. It was the erosion of acknowledgement, the slow withdrawal of regard, the gentle placement of walls where there had once been closeness. I had to remind myself that love does not always guarantee recognition. Sometimes it exists quietly, even when unseen. As the week went on, I noticed small patterns repeating: conversations I was left out of, decisions made without me, casual comments that suggested I was no longer central. And yet, I did not raise my voice. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I allowed the silence to speak for me, my presence to remain steadfast, my patience to hold firm. This was the moment where I understood the truth of emotional distance. It often appears in the quietest, softest moments where hurt is hidden behind normalcy. I began keeping a small notebook, jotting down observations, reflections, and thoughts. I wrote about Jack, about Marley, about the subtle shifts I had witnessed over weeks and months. I wrote not to accuse, but to understand, to process, to preserve my own sense of clarity. The turning point was as much internal as it was external. I was learning to separate my love from my expectations, to acknowledge reality without losing my own emotional grounding. Late one night, the weight of it all pressed against me. I sat by the window, listening to the rain tapping softly on the glass, watching droplets trickle down. The world outside was calm, indifferent, and yet full of life. I realized something important. The breaking point in relationships does not always arrive with anger or confrontation. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of absence, indifference, and overlooked presence. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, acknowledging the pain, the sadness, and the love that still remained within me. I whispered a silent prayer, not for revenge or recognition, but for patience, understanding, and the wisdom to navigate the next steps. This turning point had stripped away illusions, revealed hidden truths, and demanded that I face reality with calm, dignity, and quiet resilience. In those moments of reflection, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the gaps that had grown, hope for the possibilities that patience might still bring. I knew the coming days would be difficult, filled with subtle challenges and emotional tests. But I was ready to meet them with quiet courage, and in that quiet, I understood the first essential lesson of the turning point. Emotional truth is often revealed not through noise or conflict, but through subtle gestures, absences, and silent decisions. Recognizing it is painful, but it is also empowering, for it allows one to respond with clarity, empathy, and unwavering strength. The stage was set. The turning point had been reached, and the heart of the story was poised to move into resolution, where reflection, understanding, and the slow return of hope would begin to take shape. The mornings after that turning point felt different. The house no longer carried the soft hum of connection it once did. Breakfasts were quiet, not filled with laughter or chatter, just the clinking of utensils and the occasional sound of doors opening and closing. I found myself sitting longer at the table, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, listening to the distant sound of birds outside, letting the silence settle around me. There was a deep ache in my chest, yes, but it was accompanied by clarity. I could no longer ignore the subtle patterns, the quiet distancing, or the emotional walls that had been built around me. I started walking through the house slowly, observing it not as a caretaker, but as a quiet witness. The living room where Jack used to play with toys now held spaces that he and Marley had reshaped. The kitchen counters bore traces of new routines I wasn't part of. And yet, amidst it all, I felt an unexpected calm. This was my reality, and it was better to face it gently than to resist it with anger. I reminded myself that love does not always mean control, and presence does not always guarantee recognition. Later, I spent hours revisiting old photographs and letters tucked away in drawers. Images of Jack as a boy, birthday parties, vacations, quiet evenings by the fireplace. They brought a mixture of warmth and bittersweet nostalgia. I realized that my bond with him, though now complicated by distance, was not erased. It had shifted, and with that shift came the opportunity to reflect, to understand, and to let go of expectations that could only lead to further disappointment. A letter arrived that week, unsigned but clearly from someone who knew my heart. It read simply, "We may not always speak, but we see you. You are still part of this family." I held it close, reading the words over and over. The message was small, almost fragile, but it reminded me that quiet acknowledgement can exist even when voices are absent. My heart, though bruised, began to soften. I began journaling each evening, capturing every small observation, thought, and feeling. The act of writing became a mirror for my emotions. I could see the sorrow, the hurt, but also the enduring love I carried. I noticed myself breathing more deeply, smiling quietly at memories instead of clinging to the pain of being overlooked. I realized that this was the first step toward resolution, accepting the reality of my family's choices while holding space for my own peace. During this period, small gestures began to mean more than words. A fleeting glance from Jack, a soft nod from Marley, even a cup of tea left for me on the counter. They were subtle, but they reminded me that connection could exist in quiet forms. I started responding with calmness rather than frustration, warmth rather than withdrawal. My presence became steady, unwavering, even if it was no longer central to every decision. There were moments of introspection where I questioned everything. Did I love too much, expect too much, or fail to assert myself? Each question led me to look inward rather than outward, to seek understanding instead of blame. I realize that resolution doesn't come from changing others. It comes from changing how we meet the reality before us. Acceptance, patience, and gentle understanding became my guides. One rainy evening, I found myself sitting by the window, listening to the rhythm of droplets against the glass. Jack walked past, unaware that I was watching. I felt no bitterness, only a quiet acknowledgement of the journey we had traveled together. I understood now that relationships evolve, that love persists even when unspoken, and that sometimes distance is not rejection but a new form of connection waiting to be recognized. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle shifts within myself. The anger I had felt immediately after the turning point had softened into reflection. The sadness, though still present, no longer dictated my every thought. I could watch, listen, and be part of the family in my own way, without needing constant recognition. This inner adjustment, more than any external change, marked the beginning of true resolution. Even small conversations became moments of healing. "Mom, can you help me with this?" Jack would ask occasionally. I responded with calm guidance, smiling quietly, allowing him to feel my presence without forcing attention or acknowledgement. The quiet exchange, the gentle back and forth, reminded me that bonds are never completely broken. They are simply expressed differently as people grow, change, and navigate life. I realized that resolution was not about regaining control or restoring the past. It was about embracing the present with clarity, compassion, and quiet strength. I could let go of resentment, step back from expectations, and still carry love for my family within me. That love was steady, enduring, and no one could take it away. Even in moments of exclusion or misunderstanding, through it all, I learned the subtle power of patience. By holding steady, by remaining calm and consistent, I allowed space for healing and understanding to emerge naturally. I did not force change, nor did I demand recognition. Instead, I chose to trust that quiet presence, gentle care, and unwavering love would continue to resonate, even if silently. The days of sorrow were slowly giving way to a sense of peace. I could sit at the table without needing acknowledgement, enjoy moments of quiet with my son, and find warmth in memories rather than clinging to unmet expectations. The resolution, I realized, was not a single event. It was a process, unfolding gently, guiding me toward a place of quiet understanding and heartfelt acceptance. The days that followed felt quieter, but in that quiet, I began to notice things I had missed before. The small gestures, subtle changes, the little moments that didn't need words. Jack would sometimes leave a chair pulled out for me. Marley would glance my way with a soft smile, and even casual family dinners carried a gentleness that had been absent. It was nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but enough for my heart to recognize the connection still lived. I started taking walks around the neighborhood in the evenings, reflecting on the past, letting the cool air wash over me. Each step felt like a small release of the weight I had carried for months. I realized that my heart had room for both sadness and hope, for both grief and quiet joy. Accepting the reality of my family's choices didn't diminish my love for them. It reshaped it into something steadier, calmer, and deeper. I found myself smiling softly at old memories, laughing quietly at small, shared jokes that didn't need explanation, and feeling gratitude for the moments that still existed. The conflict that had once dominated my mind no longer defined my days. I could exist alongside it without being consumed by it. Peace was no longer a distant idea, it was present in every mindful breath, every gentle observation, every silent acknowledgement of love that did not require recognition. One evening, while helping Jack with a small project in the garage, I noticed how much he had grown, how independent he was becoming. And though a pang of nostalgia hit me, it was accompanied by a profound understanding. Love is not about possession or constant attention, it is about presence, patience, and support, even from a quiet distance. I realized that my role as his mother had changed, but it had not ended. I could offer guidance, comfort, and affection without demanding constant acknowledgement. And that was enough. Letters and notes from earlier weeks became treasures I revisited, reminding me that even brief connections can carry immense meaning. A simple, "We see you," written in someone's careful handwriting, spoke louder than long arguments or explanations ever could. It was a testament to the quiet bonds that persist even in times of conflict. I allowed these small reminders to fill my heart rather than focusing on the absence of past acknowledgement. I began writing my own letters to Jack, to Marley, to myself. They were never sent, but they served a purpose. Each word allowed me to process emotions, clarify intentions, and release unspoken pain. I discovered that forgiveness is not always about others, it is about freeing oneself from the weight of anger and expectation. I forgave quietly, patiently, and without fanfare, knowing that my peace mattered as much as theirs. The house felt warmer after that. Not because anyone had changed dramatically, but because I had. My presence became a calm anchor rather than a plea for attention. I could participate in family life without needing validation. The subtle smiles, small acknowledgments, and fleeting gestures became my new markers of connection. I was part of the family again, not in the way I had expected, but in a more gentle, patient, and lasting way. Evenings by the window became my sacred time. Watching the sun dip behind the trees, listening to the faint hum of life outside, I felt a sense of completion beginning to settle within me. It was not the ending I had imagined, but it was a meaningful one. I realized that resolution comes not from changing others, but from embracing the reality before us with calm, gentle understanding, the quiet conversations, the shared silences, the occasional glance that carried understanding. They were small victories. They reminded me that relationships are living, evolving entities. They require patience, empathy, and a willingness to see beyond immediate hurt. I felt my heart expanding, not with expectation, but with gratitude for the subtle, often overlooked moments that truly define love. In these moments, I also reflected on myself, on my resilience, my patience, and the depth of my capacity to love without conditions. I understood that while life may not always give us clear answers, it provides opportunities for growth, empathy, and understanding. I had learned to meet silence with presence, hurt with calm, and absence with patience. By the end of this period, I could sit at the dinner table without yearning for recognition, help Jack with projects without resentment, and enjoy small interactions with Marley without expectation. My heart had shifted from longing to contentment. I had learned to embrace love in its quietest, most profound forms. Resolution had arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow, steady unfolding of clarity, patience, and understanding. I knew that the journey was ongoing, but I also knew that my heart had found its calm. I could love freely, forgive quietly, and remain steadfast. No matter how the family chose to show or withhold acknowledgement, the process of letting go of resentment and embracing gentle understanding was not simple, but it was transformative. I had learned that peace does not depend on others' choices, it begins within, nurtured by acceptance, patience, and love that asks nothing in return. And in this newfound calm, I sensed the possibility of rebuilding bonds gently, without force, and without expectation. Love, I realized, is most powerful when it is steady, patient, and enduring. Even in the face of quiet neglect or subtle hurt, the mornings became my sanctuary. The soft sunlight spilling through the windows, the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside, even the distant laughter of children playing, it all felt like gentle reminders that life was still unfolding, still offering beauty despite past misunderstandings. I had begun to notice these small details with gratitude instead of longing. Each breath, each sigh of wind through the trees, carried with it a subtle sense of peace I hadn't known for months. Jack started leaving small notes in unexpected places. At first, I didn't respond, didn't feel the need to, but over time, I began looking for them, smiling quietly when I found a simple thank you or love you, Mom. Marley would sit beside me at the table, sharing stories about her day without tension, without expectation. These moments were fleeting but precious, and I learned to treasure the quiet rhythm of everyday life. I realized that my role in the family had evolved. I was no longer the center of attention, nor did I need to be. I could offer support, guidance, and affection quietly, without demanding acknowledgement. This subtle shift brought freedom. The weight of resentment and expectation lifted gradually, like fog dissolving in morning sunlight. I could enjoy my children's company without measuring it against past neglect or imagined slights. Sometimes I reflected on the times I had felt invisible, dismissed, or replaced. It stung, yes, but I no longer let it define me. Instead, I turned inward, examining my own capacity for patience, understanding, and love. I discovered that these qualities were not diminished by others' choices, they were strengthened, refined, and affirmed through practice. Each quiet interaction, each calm response, became a testament to the resilience of the human heart. One evening, while helping Jack organize his workspace, I paused and watched him carefully. He moved with confidence and independence, a young man shaped by experiences that I had both guided and observed from a distance. A soft smile spread across my face as I realized that my influence had not disappeared, it had transformed. Love does not always need to be loud. It thrives quietly, persistently, even when unseen. I began to embrace small rituals that nurtured my spirit. Morning tea by the window, writing notes I may never send, walking through the garden and noticing each bloom. These simple actions reminded me that life, with all its complications and imperfections, was still beautiful. I could exist fully in the present moment without longing for validation or recognition. Letters from the past, saved and revisited, offered perspective. They reminded me of journeys undertaken, of lessons learned, and of bonds that had endured silently. I realized that family relationships are living things, not static. They ebb and flow, expand and contract, and sometimes require patience more than immediate understanding. The quiet dinners became spaces for observation rather than expectation. I watched Jack and Marley interact, the subtle warmth of connection unfolding in small gestures, a shared smile, a helping hand, a gentle laugh. And in these moments, I understood that love's presence doesn't always need to be declared, it can exist quietly, deeply, and meaningfully. I started to forgive more consistently, not for their sake, but for my own. Forgiveness became a practice of releasing tension, freeing my heart, and making room for calm and understanding. I learned that peace is cultivated, not demanded, and that patience can be a powerful bridge across years of misunderstanding or quiet neglect. Even simple conversations became precious. I would ask Jack about his day, listen to Marley's stories, and respond with gentle interest, without expecting reciprocation. These exchanges felt like threads being woven into a tapestry of quiet connection. stitching together moments of understanding that had once seemed impossible. At night, I would sit by the window, reflecting on the journey from pain to acceptance. I felt a warmth in my chest, a sense of closure, not finality, but of understanding. I had discovered that healing is a gradual process, shaped by patience, empathy, and the willingness to embrace imperfection. Love had shifted, transformed, but it had not diminished. As I prepared for the next part of life, I began envisioning a future where interactions with my children were defined not by past hurt, but by present compassion. I could offer guidance, receive love quietly, and experience joy without expectation. Life, I realized, continues even in the aftermath of conflict. And sometimes the most profound connections are the ones nurtured in silence. The days grew calmer, and the quiet moments between us became more meaningful than I ever expected. Jack no longer needed reminders of my presence. Marley no longer hesitated to share little joys and struggles. We had reached a new rhythm, a soft, steady cadence of family life where tension no longer dominated, and understanding quietly blossomed. One afternoon, while organizing the living room, I found an old photograph tucked behind a frame. It was of us years ago, the three of us smiling on a sunny day, unaware of the complexities that would later unfold. I held it gently, remembering how love had always existed, even when unspoken. The memory brought a gentle ache, a bittersweet reminder that life's lessons are often learned in quiet, unnoticed ways. I realized that my children had grown into people shaped not only by my guidance but by their own experiences. And in that realization, I found freedom. Freedom from expectations, freedom from disappointment, and freedom to love without condition. My role as a mother had changed. Yes, but it had not disappeared. It had evolved, quiet and enduring, much like the morning sun rising over the garden outside my window. Even the small gestures, Jack leaving a note on my bedside table, Marley making tea without asking, a shared glance across the kitchen were reminders that connection endures in the simplest acts. I no longer demanded affection. I simply received it in its quiet, authentic form. These moments felt like threads, weaving a tapestry of love that had been patiently waiting for us to notice it. I thought often of the past, the misunderstandings, the quiet hurt, the nights of loneliness. But now, I could look back without bitterness. I understood that love is rarely perfect and that patience and silence often carry wisdom louder than words ever could. I had learned that sometimes, stepping back and allowing life to unfold naturally teaches lessons that cannot be rushed. There were nights when I simply sat by the window, watching the world outside, reflecting on how far we had come. I understood that true healing takes time, that family bonds can stretch and bend but ultimately endure. The quiet resilience of the human heart never ceases to amaze me, and I felt a profound gratitude for the lessons of patience, forgiveness, and understanding that life had quietly taught me. Jack approached me one evening, his eyes soft, his tone gentle. "Mom," he said, "I know I didn't always show it, but I appreciate everything you've done for me." And in that moment, the weight I had carried for so long lifted. No grand gestures were necessary, just acknowledgement, quiet and heartfelt, bridging years of unspoken emotion. As I reflect on this journey, I see that family is not always defined by proximity, by words spoken, or by grand events. Sometimes it is the subtle, persistent presence, the gentle support, the quiet love, the patience through misunderstanding that defines it. I understood that true connection often resides in silence, in small acts of care, and in moments of awareness that might otherwise go unnoticed. The world outside may rush, may demand attention, may insist on drama, but within the quiet of my home, I found peace. I found understanding. I found love that does not need to be loud to exist. And in that love, I discovered a strength I had never recognized before, a strength born of patience, compassion, and unwavering hope. And now, as I close this chapter of my story, I feel a calmness that I have long sought. Life does not always unfold as we expect, nor does understanding arrive on our schedule. Yet, in patience, in quiet reflection, And in the small, meaningful gestures that weave a family together, there is hope, there is love, there is peace. And this is where my story ends tonight. Life doesn't always give us answers right away. Sometimes, God asks us to stay patient, stay kind, and stay silent not because we are weak, but because He sees what others do not. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Maybe someone needed this reminder today. Thank you for listening with an open heart. May God see every silent struggle and replace pain with peace. Until next time, this was Voice of Auntie Universe.